Joining us in his usual Friday spot from NFL Network, my fellow inside man is, ladies and gentlemen, Tom Pelissero. Good to see you, Tom. How are you?
Tommy. Good to see you, Rich. Doing great. What's up to my boys in the studio?
Tommy P, what up, baby?
What's up, Tommy?
You look like you're hunkered down, man.
You're killing it.
That's what you look like to me, that you got all your supplies, the cold snaps out there right now. That's what you look like to me, Tom.
I have never seen it before. Checking the weather app last night. I wonder how cold it is. Feels like temp minus 41 here in Minneapolis. That's the record, wow. I think, anytime I've ever checked it.
Like, if you weren't such a hardworking, lead pipe wielding professional of your own right, looking at you in the sweats and seeing you, I'd think you'd given up. Like Seinfeld style. You've given up. This is it. But it's okay. Lots going on.
It says, quote, catastrophic ice and heavy snow.
Ladies and gentlemen.
Yeah.
Catastrophic. I mean, it's like frozen.
Wow.
All right, Tom, let's get into the sports here. And the naming of Jesse Minter. It didn't surprise me, but walk me through the Ravens process that wound up with the DC of the Chargers as the 8th seed.
Well, when we were doing the breaking news on John Harbaugh being fired a couple of weeks ago, one of the first names that came out of my mouth as a logical replacement was Jesse Minter. He had been in that building for 4 years. We all know about the Baltimore to Michigan to the Chargers Harbaugh connection. Minter has checked all three of those boxes. Spent his time in Michigan, then was the defensive coordinator of the Chargers. Didn't get any head coaching interviews last year, but certainly had a bunch of opportunities. Really this came to a head a couple of days ago. He was down in Miami interviewing for the Raiders head coaching job, then flew to Baltimore to interview for the Ravens job, had a second interview scheduled with the Browns. He let them know, if they weren't going to make him an offer, he wasn't going to come and go through the second interview. And everybody, including the Raiders, believed Minter was probably going to end up back in Baltimore. The interesting part of the timing here, Rich, was, they essentially knew they were hiring Jesse Minter on Wednesday night. The issue was they had a Thursday interview with Joe Brady. Well, they wanted to go through with that interview, in part, I believe, because Joe Brady now, depending how some other things fall, could end up being the offensive coordinator. Another logical name that came up way back at the start of this as a potential candidate to take over. When you're talking about Lamar Jackson, his skill set at this time in his career, he's not, built like Josh Allen, but there are some similar types of things that you can do in terms of the run threat, in terms of the vertical passing. Joe Brady would be a fit. Now the question becomes, does Joe Brady get the Bills head coaching job? Does he potentially get the Cardinals head coaching job, which he interviewed for a couple of days ago? Is there even a scenario where he goes back to Buffalo as the OC? That seems like the least likely of the options right now. We'll see how some of these things fall, and it might take a little bit of time. But if you're talking about who the likely candidates would be to take over the offense now in Baltimore, with Minter coming from the defensive side, I would put Joe Brady along with the likes of Cliff Kingsbury as a potential option. Maybe Matt Nagy could be an option. Those types of guys who run those offenses, all different shades of it, but all potentially could be a fit for where they want to take Lamar in that offense in Baltimore.
So I guess, as you know, it's a What's More Likely Friday. Who's more likely to be back in Buffalo next year, Joe Brady or Keon Coleman? Tom?
Keon Coleman, through no fault, really, well, I guess his fault because of various things and, not showing up on time for meetings, dropping footballs in the end zone. He kind of did put himself in that position, but fairly rare for the owner to jump in and let everyone know exactly who was at fault for a pick that to this point, doesn't look like it's worked out very well. There were a lot of different things in that press conference. And any of us any of us who have spent any amount of time, though, around Terry Pagula, no, he doesn't speak publicly often.
Right.
But when he does, there is no filter. You don't quite know what he's going to say. He is extremely blunt and honest, and you got a lot of honesty through the course of that press conference, whether it was about Keon Coleman, whether it was about him defending Brandon Beane. Somebody in the crowd asked Beane about, various things in terms of the idea that he ran a power play. And Terry said something that maybe shed a little bit of light on things behind the scenes, which is if you're running a power play, you're out. I'm not saying Sean McDermott ran a power play, but certainly McDermott had voiced his concerns and frustration with what he perceived to be not having enough talent on the roster. Obviously, Pagula so strongly disagreed with that not only did he fire Sean McDermott, he promoted Brandon Beane, who now is going to be over the top of the new head coach rather than both reporting to the owner. And Beane, along with Terry Pagula, along with Josh Allen, they made abundantly clear in that press conference is going to be sitting in on everything here. They are now running a unique coaching search that, depending who you ask, this might be the best job of all 10 that we are filling in this offseason cycle.
Yeah, despite the bluntness or the emotions that we saw spilled out by Terry Pagula in that conversation, he did hold on to a coach for 9 years, and he does have Josh Allen, and that is something that I think a lot of people would love, along with the fan base and the new stadium and lots of reason to be excited otherwise in Western New York. Is Philip Rivers really in line? Like, I know we were talking about him as a possible coaching candidate down the line, and he did say in front of his locker before going back to Alabama prep school, coach, that absolutely he thinks he could coach in the NFL. Is this real, Tom?
Well, let's go back for a second here, just in terms of the parallels. And I'm not going to bring up Jeff Saturday because nobody wants to be put in that sentence in terms of how that worked out when he came back for the Colts. But you remember several years ago, Josh McCown was coaching high school football. All of a sudden, the Houston Texans brought him in and interviewed him for the head coaching job. There was a feeling, there were some people in the organization at that time who wanted to hire Josh McCown as the head coach immediately because he had all the traits, because he had played, close to 20 years in the league, because he had some experience, even if it was at the high school level, had been in that seat. Philip Rivers, certainly, a Hall of Fame caliber player. He's a better player than Josh McCown. The question is he a stronger coaching candidate based upon the credentials that he would bring into the building? If you're looking at somebody who's going to bring energy and leadership, certainly, Philip Rivers, by virtue of him, playing a football game after 3 practices at age 44, looking like he had not passed on dessert a whole lot during his 4+ years outside of the league. If he can come back and do that with his brain, what could he do if he's out there just calling plays for a quarterback? There's a lot of other things that go into that head coaching job. I know in the NBA, it's more common for, former players just to step right in. It's a much more complicated job, frankly, to come into the NFL. Not impossible. They're interviewing him for a reason. Maybe like Josh McCown, it could end up being, all right, he's not ready to be the head coach now, but can we convince him to come in and be the quarterback's coach or even the offensive coordinator? I would tell you this. They're wide open in terms of this search. I know that people initially said, well, it's Joe Brady versus Brian Daboll. Those guys both have interviewed for the job. Both are possibilities. I would say probably Joe Brady a little bit more strongly than Brian Daboll at this time. But they want to go in with an open mind. This is something very open-minded to bring in Philip Rivers. They're doing these interviews down in Florida. He lives in Alabama. It's a short trip over. If nothing else, you're going to be entertained by a few hours in that room. But they didn't want to take a hard line of we've got to have an offensive coordinator be the guy that we're promoting. It can't just be, well, we need this specific profile. They don't want to be doing another search for another 9+ years. And the fact that Josh is in those meetings, they're very seriously going to take into account what he wants. He played against Philip Rivers. The two of them have a relationship. We'll see exactly how real this becomes. I would just tell you, Rich, I don't get the sense that, you're going to wake up tomorrow and Philip Rivers is the new head coach of the Bills. I believe they are going to be patient through this process. They quite likely are going to do some additional interviews next week. But because of the rules, anybody who wins their games this weekend, they can't talk to next week. They have to have the coaches, those teams, lose in order to talk to them because they didn't do an initial round back while Sean McDermott still had a job because they were in the playoffs.
Tom Pelissero here on the Rich Eisen Show. Where does the Steelers head coaching search sit, Tom?
They're with Anthony Weaver right now, Dolphins defensive coordinator. Everywhere that Anthony Weaver, and he's been in the cycle now 3 or 4 times, everywhere that Weaver interviews, I remember he interviewed in Atlanta at one time, he interviewed in Washington. Everyone who interviews him says he's unbelievable. He's a former player, has coached in the league for a number of years, but also played, including with the Ravens, who interviewed him for their head coaching job. Very, very engaging, has strong leadership traits, will need a strong staff around him. But you can say that for a lot of young coaches within the league. If you think of what the Steelers' historical hiring patterns have been, Weaver's a little bit older. He's in his 40s. Usually they've hired guys in their mid-30s to be the head coach and then try to keep them for 15 to 20 or more years. But Weaver, fills a lot of those things that generally the Rooney family has been looking for. But I would also say Mike McCarthy remains a serious candidate. He had his interview in person for the job on Wednesday. Pittsburgh guy, this would be his dream job. He grew up rooting for the Steelers. Mike McCarthy brings something different to the table, and I think than I think virtually any other candidate for any job in this cycle, which is the quarterback development history. If eventually you are needing, whether it's Will Howard or somebody you're drafting, you're going to have to develop a young quarterback. And everywhere Mike McCarthy has been, from being in Kansas City and bringing along Rich Gannon into the second act of his career, Brett Favre, who had a down period in Green Bay, and he was a Super Bowl, or excuse me, MVP runner-up in 2007. Aaron Rodgers, going from a guy who did not look good in his first preseason in the league to being a four-time NFL MVP. And Dak Prescott played the best football of his life under Mike McCarthy. I'll never understand, Rich, the slight that Mike McCarthy takes in terms of not being put in that same category as the guys with almost identical resumes to him, the Tomlins and Sean Paytons and John Harbaughs of the world. McCarthy's a very serious candidate in Pittsburgh for a reason, and they still may choose to go on longer because, again, Art Rooney has not presided over a coaching search yet, and given how rarely the Steelers do one, this may be the only one that that he does before he passes it down to the next generation of the family. They may take their time here. They could make a decision as soon as tomorrow. I would think, if I were guessing, this goes into next week, which would allow them to go back and spend some in-person time, potentially with, for instance, Chris Shula and Nate Scheelhaus, two guys that they interviewed in that first virtual round.
Well, answering the question you just had moments ago, Tom, about why McCarthy's not placed in a much higher level of respect by media members or owners for another job outside of Jerry Jones, there was that damaging article after he got fired midseason by the Packers that Rodgers was calling plays on his own because he didn't trust McCarthy's play calling anymore. There was all the crazy stuff about how prepared McCarthy was for games itself. Whether that's right or wrong, that's a narrative that's tough to break up to the point where we have time for it now. You kind of surprised us on a Monday conversation. We were out of time when you said that Rodgers could potentially come back to Pittsburgh if they hire McCarthy. So those two are copacetic, Tom?
Those two have a relationship that transcends the professional relationship, which I think, like plenty of them, if you're around anyone long enough, you become so comfortable that you can be contentious with them at times. I mean, with Aaron Rodgers, he knows what Mike McCarthy has done for his career. He has spoken publicly about that. And, when Mike was let go, encouraged people in Green Bay to give him the type of send-off that, frankly, he didn't really get from the Packers organization when they fired him an hour after a game at Lambeau Field. Those two spent time together the first time that, Mike with the Cowboys went back and faced Aaron. They've always had a long-standing positive relationship. I do believe that if Aaron Rodgers were coming back to play for one coach in 2026, it would be Mike McCarthy. But I think the people may have misconstrued when I mentioned that on the show the other day as, well, this is the Steelers trying to lure back Aaron Rodgers. That's not it at all. If they hire Mike McCarthy, and that's not a given, if they hire Mike McCarthy, they are doing it for the totality of what direction they think that they can go right now. They've got a very, very veteran roster. Art Rooney has said publicly he never wants to rip it to the studs and go full tank mode and just take a season off. He feels like every season is too important for that. So if you were sitting there going, what do we need to push this roster forward? Yes, there's going to be some changes. There are some longtime Mike Tomlin guys who probably aren't going to be back on this team, but why not get a guy whose track record has been winning everywhere that he has been? McCarthy's been to the playoffs 12 times in 18 seasons. He's developed quarterbacks. If you look at the offensive numbers, he's had very good offenses throughout the course of his career. The potential of an Aaron Rodgers return is it's kind of a bonus. It at least keeps that door open where if there's another coach who has no relationship with Aaron Rodgers, he might just say, I've had enough. And I know that, there were several different things that were written at the time. I think that any time that you have these long-time relationships that begin to go south, there's people who, may have axes to grind or they, simply aren't happy anymore. Aaron has always been somebody who, he'll say certain things and he'll take his little shots, and that's just his personality. But in terms of where their relationship is now, I think that in itself speaks to how overblown, the frankly hate toward Mike McCarthy has gotten. I mean, I don't know what more you want to get out of your head coach than, being in the mix every single year. Yeah, you want to win playoff games. Mike McCarthy's won more playoff games than any active coach except for Andy Reid and John Harbaugh. He's got more playoff wins than Mike Tomlin, than Sean Payton, than the younger guys like McVay and Shanahan, who obviously have a long way to go. Mike McCarthy's been a highly successful, coach in the NFL. The Cowboys, since their last Super Bowl win, Rich, have exactly 6 seasons of 12 wins or more. 3 of those were by McCarthy in a 5-year span. It's baffling to me how Mike McCarthy gets put into this bucket of not being in the same tier as those other coaches, which, frankly, Mike's not immune to it. And it's one of many reasons that he'd be highly motivated, not to mention the fact that, he grew up sweeping the floors at his dad's bar and grill in Pittsburgh and cheering for the Steelers on Sundays. To go back after coaching the Packers and the Cowboys and take on maybe the 3rd most iconic franchise in all of football would be pretty cool.
NFL insider Tom McCarthy here on the Rich Eisen Show. All right. In the couple minutes I have left here, Tom, let's go here. Jimmy Haslam bristled at the Browns front office and operation being termed dysfunctional. That said, we're sitting here the Friday before championship weekend. The job is still open from the first Monday of the coaching cycle. Word is they are not Rooney Rule compliant. They cannot hire somebody right now. The Bills might be looking at somebody that they want to hire. The Bills are already Rooney Rule compliant. Their job's been open a fraction of the time, and we're reading about people pulling their names out of consideration for the Browns head coaching job. What is happening there, Tom Pelissero?
First of all, I would say Andrew Berry is the last person who is just going to interview somebody solely to fulfill the Rooney Rule.
Correct.
If he's conducting an interview, he wants it to be with someone who's a real candidate. Mike McDaniel would have fulfilled that. He decided that he just didn't want to follow through on that job coming off of his initial Zoom here. So that's one factor. You're right. They're the only team that has not conducted a single qualifying interview. That'll change, or is scheduled to change next week when they have a second interview with Nate Scheelhaase from the Rams. I would just say this. The Browns search process and interview process, which they have run a number of times, is unlike any other in the NFL. And it plays to certain types of candidates. They are a data-driven operation in Cleveland. And so they spend an extraordinary amount of time gathering data on their coaching candidates. You're talking about taking a personality test. You're talking about writing an essay. You're talking about completing homework assignments going into both the first and the second rounds of interviews. It plays toward the types of candidates that they have in the mix, which is very, very smart people in a lot of cases that just often happen to be tall, thin guys who came from Ivy League schools, so that's certainly not a requirement. That's the type of candidate generally that is going to fit into a data-driven environment. So
there's a written test? There's a written test, huh? Really? Like they want you to write an essay? This is why I want to be the coach of the Cleveland Browns? Or
questionnaires, a multi-part essay, a personality test, and then additional homework assignments if you get through the first round to get into the second round. Which you can imagine then.
The answer can't be Google me? Like you can't go Signetti? I know I'm being flippant, Tom, but that to me, I don't know. You're hopping around the country interviewing for jobs, kids, spouses, boxes being packed because you've hit the road and you're going to sit down and write an essay? You
could imagine then when certain candidates decide not to follow through on interviews, part of it may be that it's more than just show up in a nice suit and answer questions in the room. And that speaks to how the Browns organization operates. Sure. Paul DePodesta got there 10 years ago. He built out a massive data and analytics department. Those people have a strong voice in everything that the Browns do. There's a lot of time that is consumed once you're on the job with those conversations. And so the interview process is kind of a preview of that. So we'll see what direction their search goes. Again, sure. Grant Udinski, Nate Scheelhaase, 2 big brain dudes who, again, happen to be tall, thin guys.
Nice.
They both are in the mix. Udinski's there now. Scheelhaase expected to interview on Monday. If it's not one of those two, then the other candidates that we know of as of right now are Jim Schwartz, who's the defensive coordinator, who they want to keep regardless, and Todd Monken, who does not fit in any of the categories that I just mentioned, other than he's a very intelligent guy who's run successful offenses in the NFL. I would tell you, Rich, the sense is the Browns are very intrigued by the Udinski and Shieldhouse possibilities because they're both guys who are, I mean, Grant just turned 30. He's in his first year as the Jaguars OC, but he's unbelievably brilliant. Shieldhouse is in his mid-30s, was at Iowa State most recently with the Rams. Those guys fit the pattern. If they ultimately the Browns on their scorecards that they collect do not decide that those guys are the best candidates, then the belief within the league is the default would be Jib Schwartz. Then you're trying to figure out, all right, well, now what do you do on offense to pair him? Who is willing to take that offensive coordinator job? There's just a lot of steps in the process, Rich, but the Browns, this is not new. They have done this for a long time, and it's just, as one high-powered coaching agent said to me the other day when we were going through the list of all the openings, the Browns are the Browns. Their process is different than everyone else's, and we'll see where it leads them this time.
Tom, thanks for the time. I'll see you on NFL Game Day morning, 9 a.m. Eastern Time, 6 hours on NFL Network. See you, buddy.
Can't wait.
Hey, you made it all the way to the end. Thanks for that. Check us out every single day streaming live on Disney Plus and the ESPN app 12 to 3 Eastern.